Hello, good evening. My name is Felipe Rojas. I'm an assistant professor of archaeology at the Tchaikovsky Institute and of Ancient Western Asian Studies over in the Department of Egyptology. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Peter Manuelian is the Philip J. King Professor of Egyptology at Harvard University and the founding director of the Giza Archives at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He has published extensively on a wide array of Egyptological topics and made important contributions to Egyptian history, archaeology, and epigraphy. Among his many publications, I signal two: his Living in the Past, Studies in Archaism of the Egyptian 26th Dynasty, which should be of interest to anyone studying the sophisticated manipulation of the past in the past. And also an entirely different book that should serve as a reminder to all specialists in the ancient world that our audience is potentially very vast. I mean, Hieroglyphs from A to Z, a rhyming book with ancient Egyptian stencils for kids. He shares with many members of this audience a special interest in the graphic and indeed iconographic nature of writing, and specifically of Egyptian hieroglyphs. This semester, Professor Stephen Houston and I are teaching a class called Lost Languages, which deals with ancient writing systems in a comparative perspective, from Mesopotamian cuneiform to the Cherokee syllabary, and from Tolkien's scrambled runes to Egyptian hieroglyphs. And many of our students are here, both undergrad and grad students. So we are delighted that Professor Manuelian has agreed to share his expertise in digital epigraphy with us today, for he is an exceptionally inventive scholar, exploring different ways of incorporating new technologies in research and in teaching. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Manuelian.
Thank you, sir. Thanks very much, Felipe, and to Jim Allen. And no, this is not a lecture about my cats. Let me hit that button. There we go. So it's a pleasure to be back down here. Again, I always like coming to Brown, and even the drive doesn't faze me. It's just a treat to be back in Providence and in this fantastic building, by the way, which makes us all very envious and jealous. So this talk grew out of a course that we're doing this semester. We're inspired by all of these imagery of the past and lost languages and digging the glyphs and all kinds of similar courses. And so we're trying to teach digital epigraphy. This is a stunning example of Old World and New World collaboration with a colleague of mine. You see his name up there. He's doing the Mayan side of things and I'm doing the Egyptian side of things. And it's a privilege for us too that some of Brown's graduate students are making the trek one day a week up to join us. So I'm always struck by the different definitions of epigraphy, and when we try to look at this subject, it's fascinating how different fields will define it in different ways. And if there are classicists in the audience, maybe they can correct that definition. But in the classical world, epigraphy seems to mean something very different from what it means to us Egyptologists. Inscriptions contributing to the understanding of literary texts, papyri, archaeological evidence, and the other way around. That is somewhat different from what I try to do and what our field tries to focus on, which is recording. So the editing, the drawing, the translation, publication of monumental inscriptions and their scenes in as definitive a manner as possible. So my focus is to take a look at the Egyptians' mastery of 2D relief and painting. 3D sculpture is, of course, another topic, equally valid, but not something that I'll talk about tonight. And so some of the readings for that course we developed get more theoretical than others, but what we're aiming at in this course is the red little box at the bottom there, trained judgment. So from depiction to representation, to truth to nature, mechanical objectivity, and through the generations, these have come to take on different meanings and different significance. We hope at the end, though, that one can interpret and represent these aspects of ancient representation in what we'll call trained judgment. Egyptian images are complex. As you can see here, there's perceptions and receptions, both in antiquity and, of course, in our own era. And our construct, our interpretation of these scenes, of course, may not match that of the ancient Egyptians. For example, you're looking here at a deceased couple plowing in the fields of paradise in the afterlife. But when was the last time that you were in a muddy field wearing your best tuxedo? Right? So there are things going on here that are not exactly just reproductions of daily life scenes and have significance in afterlife representations, and to pay attention to those is part of the epigraphic process. And something I love about this culture is its iconographic nature. Symbols, art is writing, writing is art, magic and symbolism are in the texts and the scenes. They have icons. We have icons. What do they mean to us? What do they mean to them? And all of that, too, goes into our trained judgment, into our interpretive process. As an example of how deeply meshed into everyday life text and image is, this is one of my favorite objects. It's a branding iron with 2 triliteral hieroglyphs right there. So next time you see a cow walking around campus with an ankh and a nefer, you'll know that we're dealing with the mixture of everyday life and text and images, art and writing. So epigraphy, why do this stuff? As we put our course together this semester, we tried to come up with our definitions and ask the basic questions, of course. Why record? And then what should we record? Or the other way around, what should we leave out? As Steve Jobs was so fond of always saying, what do we produce? But more importantly, what do we leave out of the product? How do we record? How do we do this? And my focus in many recent years has been the digital approach to all of this. So why do it digitally? Why not just pen and ink? And then finally, where to record. That doesn't mean in your bedroom or your office, but rather where is your final destination? What is publishing these days in the widest sense of the word? So why record? I think you can probably guess most of the reasons for that. Everyone in this room is dedicated to one or the other of these topics here. Understanding the past, obviously. As you look at these things and interpret, oops, I jumped backwards. As you look at these things and interpret them, they take on a, this slide doesn't want to play ball. Let me go back one more. There. Documentation, preservation. Maybe the one that's not so familiar is what I call digital repatriation. And that's my concept of trying to give something back to the Egyptians in this case. If museum collections are obviously not going to be emptied out and shipped back to Cairo, there is something that can be done in terms of digital repatriation, whether it is scans, links, databases, 3D recreations. All of this should be mirrored, I feel, back in Egypt as well. And I think epigraphy has a role to play there as well. And then, of course, in the epigraphic process, you are preserving and creating research opportunities for additional interpretation or even correction if the drawings need some correction as well. The reason I threw this on the board is just to remind us all that our approach is largely in the Western academic tradition, and to be sure there are Eastern attempts at documenting ancient Egypt. That's not the focus of tonight's talk, but it's always good to be aware that it's there, and it's something that I hope will gain in study and popularity as these documents become more accessible. So why do epigraphy? Aren't the photos good enough? Why do we have to go through all of this rigmarole to try to produce these facsimile drawings? Well, is it possible to describe what you're looking at here? It's a tough one. Obviously, we have an inscription. We've got something going on up above, of course. How about a different photo with some different lighting? Well, the picture is emerging a little bit better now. Still hard to tell what's happening, especially up at the top. And then even the professional studio photograph, very clear, very beautiful, even a meter stick involved as well, but what's happening at the top is still tough. So many ways to then further this interpretation beyond the photograph, and they all serve different purposes, some legitimate, some a little more difficult. Here's an example of a hand copy of the stela that we just looked at. Nice that we've got reproduction of the basic layout, that helps a lot. But what's missing? The lunette, right? Whatever was going on at the top of the scene. In publications, you'll find this as well. This is a beautifully computer typeset version of the text. And in this case, we have the lunette text is also reproduced. But what's the problem? We've flipped the inscription, right? So when you're trying to collate or figure out original layout and things, that has fallen by the wayside. So that's an extra hurdle and hard to collate with the original. Nowadays, we're trying to avoid that mistake made in some earlier publications where text and image are pulled asunder, and entire publications will just be images or just be the texts, and they really do belong together. So once we get into epigraphy, we're starting to see the full nature of the context of the stela. This time, at least, we can tell the scene up above. We have the king with his pet lion nearby, and he's being presented donuts by his high official Usur right there. And we've got the layout, we have the orientation, the texts are numbered, and we're on our way to understanding the entire context. As for the integration of text and image, I think nothing says it's better than this particular scene of Thutmose III, the reciprocal relationship par excellence. If you look at this text right here, you'll see it's oriented with the king, and the hieroglyphs are facing towards the god as he makes his various libations and burnt offerings. And in return, we've flipped the hieroglyphs in the same sentence to show the reciprocal relationship and what the god is then offering back towards the king in his given life. So you can't take these things apart. You can't rip that text out and remove it from the scene here and expect to have the same interpretation of what's going on. So the style of individual signs does matter, as well as their orientation, their size, and they can help us then, whether it's a diachronic analysis, sequential development, what have you, or even political history. Something like that is a great example of political history. So the man on the right is in good shape, ka'aper, but what happened on the left? Totally expunged in antiquity, wiped out for political reasons, most likely. And to reproduce that epigraphically is bringing the historical record forward. That is a significant part of the history of that monument and shouldn't just be left out as a blank space. In this case, it's a god who's been attacked, and perhaps you can make out the traces there in the red box of the 3 signs for the god Amun that have been expunged here. And so here too, epigraphy can contribute to our reconstruction of an ancient religious schism. And then one of my favorites of Senenmut, high official under Queen Hatshepsut, where he's actually inventing combinations of hieroglyphs on his own. He says, signs which I made according to the idea of my heart and with my own work, which I have not found in the writings of the ancestors. Great line. So why do epigraphy? All of those reasons. And then some of the more mundane ones, of course. It's deteriorating. The monuments are doomed as time goes by, and we are in a race against time, population, the elements, salinization of the soil, salt crystals, flake surfaces, tourism, you name it. I don't think I need to ask you which of these photographs you'd rather draw from if you were trying to create the fullest archaeological or epigraphic record of the scene. Obviously, 1929 is a much better candidate than today. Or how about this magnificent granite sarcophagus now in the Brooklyn Museum? I'm sure many of you have seen that before. People walk by it all the time. It's from Giza. But how many of you know in this photograph in its original place that it had this spectacular painted border pattern and the beautiful entwined motifs here? And there's a little bit of a close-up. Completely gone from the original piece today, faded away and not noted on any labels. And so you would have half the picture if you were studying this sarcophagus today. And then this is a repeating Google shot between 1984 and 2012, and it'll repeat a couple of times so you can catch it. This is Cairo and the Giza area developing over the generations. And in a moment, it'll zoom in on Giza itself. So I'm circling with the hand there, the 3 pyramids, and you can see all the development out in the desert. Imagine the stresses and the pressures this is putting on the monuments and causing us to step up our efforts in our epigraphic documentation. And then I don't need to tell you, of course, about recent years and certain security challenges to sites as far away as Middle or Upper Egypt and as close to Cairo even as Giza. This was a year or 2 ago, but much more recently we've had other challenges to preserving the monuments as well. So I don't know if anyone created a drawing of an inscription on the side of this pear statue or not, but I certainly hope that that did happen. So what to record? We know obviously we want to represent the carving, that's clear, that's why we have these courses in epigraphy. But when you look at a drawing like this, the first question is, what's happening in the white spaces, right? How can we tell? Look at the seated man's body there. What's going on with the lines that suddenly stop? Are we getting enough information? And I would suggest, following tradition not created or invented by me, but in recent generations of good epigraphic method, that you've got to account for carving where it's present, and you've got to account for why it's absent if it is absent. So in this stela, for example, you can see the actual block lines are indicated, and where the carving is interrupted, you now have a little bit of a indication why. And I'll zoom in on the couple there, and you see where his face is damaged, and the shading is representing that. So this is a more complete picture of the record, and is telling you what's present, what's absent, and hopefully with the conventions that are being used, it will get the point across as to why. Other pitfalls. What's wrong with this drawing? I would quiz my class. And the answer is, you can't tell what's going on here, can you? So because of the same line weight for the carving and for the damaged areas, it's very hard to tell what's a hieroglyph and what is a damaged area, what might be plaster, what might be some other convention. It's almost like these guys have leprosy, and it's tough to figure out how to separate the wheat from the chaff and get at the information that you want. Unfinished texts, got plenty of those too, right? That needs to be indicated. And as usual, the carving stops just before the name is meant to be added to tell us who the tomb owner is, but you want to be able to indicate or account for that as well. So in a facsimile line drawing, you want to show where the carving is ending and whether the grant ran out or somebody died earlier or what the reason is. And then in this Middle Kingdom relief, can you see what's unusual or eye-catching about this one? Number one might be the mixture of sunk relief up above for the text and raised relief down below. But even more than that, if you look over in this area, something very interesting is going on. You can see right around here it's been scooped out, and maybe someone has been expunged, and this gentleman has been added instead, and he's in a different hand, he's at a different scale, and he's altogether a secondary addition. That's something that the original publication completely glossed over and missed, and it wasn't even mentioned. And this is a little bit overexposed and blown out, but there's an attempt here to show the scooped out depression that this figure was recarved in. So how to record and why do it digitally? Here you see the traditional approach that many, many expeditions use. This is a mylar tracing paper that's actually affixed to the surface of the stone, something that nowadays makes me very nervous. I don't like direct contact, with the antiquities themselves. And back up one moment. So there's a long tradition here, and there are many, many methods for epigraphy, and I thought I'd just backtrack a little bit and we'll go back to the time of some of the early travelers and the great expeditions and how this tradition grew and changed over the generations. Because I'd submit to you that while we think we're doing it right now, the next generation will probably look back on our drawings and think of all the changes and what we're leaving out and follow a new paradigm of that, I'm pretty certain. So who's the first epigrapher? Who's the first Egyptologist? Maybe it is Khaim Wasset, the fourth son of Ramses, who visited so many monuments and cleared them and restored some of them to a certain extent. But we can jump forward a little bit for lack of time and start with Napoleon, which really opened up Egypt, Egyptomania, a Western focus on the monuments and an attempt to document them and bring them to a larger audience. So the Description de l'Égypte, of course, that came out afterwards and almost bankrupted France in all of its many volumes, was a masterstroke in trying to bring Egyptian culture, Egyptian drawing styles to the world. And just a few examples here which are fascinating to look at. If you see this one and this one, take a look at the European insertion into this ancient Egyptian drawing where you see these full frontal torsos, something the Egyptians, of course, would never have done. And yet we've got this interesting blend of a kind of Europeanized style onto the Egyptian relief. Fast forward to a much more modern and I'd say accurate rendering of the same scene from Chicago House, from one of the Oriental Institute publications, or put them side by side and makes for an interesting comparison. Of course, down below you don't see any full frontal torsos. Other giants of the early years, Gardner Wilkinson, for example, in the 1820s, was in Egypt, and his groundbreaking manners and customs of the ancient Egyptians brought many, many reliefs and paintings to the larger world, often in beautiful color. Here's one from the tomb of Rekhmire, where he's got some of it right, not all of it right, but by comparison you can see how well he did or how poorly he did. In the great expeditions, Champollion and his student Rossellini came and produced their monumental tomes as well, with some glorious color reproductions here. Again, we're getting a little bit more accurate, but we've still got this sort of Europeanized insertion into the playing field. Along the way, I think this wonderful tool developed and played a role that is perhaps not quite so widely recognized in Egyptology, and that is the camera lucida. You see that beautiful sketch of the tomb of Montemhait in the Asasif up above, and travelers and artists like Robert Hay were working in the 1800s. as well. And I want to play a little clip here from some of the research done by David Hockney and his book Secret Language, where he's talking about the value of the camera lucida and how the great masters, people want to give them full credit for this magical power, whereas in fact many of them may have been using the camera lucida, which projects an image of what you're looking at and you can actually trace it. And the reason I bring that up now is because that's what a lot of digital epigraphy really is. It is glorified tracing of the original in as accurate a method as possible.
I want to come to this because we've got this great video. Talk me through it as we look at this, where we're seeing what you're talking about. What is that?
There's the projection of the baptistry. That's the mirror on a stand, you see. It's still got the handle on it.
Yeah.
In fact, it's still got the price on the back, actually. But there is a clear projection of the baptistry from that mirror. Now, the laws of optics do not change. That a mirror would have done that in 1420. And look at the lines. I'm pointing out that because it's an octagonal building, you get the diagonal lines. All I'm suggesting is Brunelleschi must have known this, seen it, then of course he goes home and works out the mathematical laws of perspective.
So there you go. I think that many of the early draftsmen and epigraphers were doing this kind of work as well, and very few of them were actually doing totally freehand drawings of Egyptian scenes and inscriptions. But some were, and were quite talented at it. So there's the camera lucida, and in fact there's a Kickstarter project down below to recreate these things, and I invested, and I can't wait to get mine for Christmas in a month or so when they send them to me. It should be a lot of fun. Well, back to the great expeditions, perhaps for epigraphic purposes, the most significant one, of course, is Lepsius in the 1840s, the Prussian mission that went up and down the country with the humble mandate to record everything in Egypt and Nubia, and basically did in this massive series of elephant tomes. And if there's one theme that I keep coming back to in this subject is the older the sources, hopefully photographic, but even sometimes drawing, the older the better, because you've got so much preserved in these Lepsius drawings that is now gone through vandalism or deterioration or fading of colors. And once again, look at the generational changes from Champollion to Lepsius in this same scene here, this Hittite fortress from the Ramesseum. Great change of perspective or personal insertion into the reconstruction, and it will change again in our era. The beauty of the Lepsius publications is that they're now all online and in fairly good resolution, so you can grab them all and study them, whoops, to your heart's content. And my cat seemed to want to get involved in this. What happened? One moment, let me turn that back on. I must be jiggling something here. I apologize for that. When we finally get to the early 20th century, now we're in the era of the great expeditions. And Petrie, of course, setting the stage for a much more responsible archaeological method. Not the greatest epigrapher, though, although he realizes this has its place. And here's one of reproductions from Meidum. But at least we're getting reproductions and drawings in his publications. By the same token, the other great archaeologist and Egyptologist to follow him was George Reisner. The sexiest part of his expedition was the photographic documentation, not so much the epigraphic work. There are plenty of line drawings produced by his expedition, but I wouldn't call them exemplary or forwarding our knowledge of epigraphic process. The other great American Egyptologist of the time, of course, was Breasted, himself not particularly adept at epigraphy, but of course he set up the Oriental Institute's Epigraphic Survey, or Chicago House, and that, of course, has had a lasting and substantial impact on how we approach reproducing Egyptian reliefs. As I mentioned, the Reisner expedition, the greatest part was the photographic documentation, and it was large plate cameras. It was 8x10 glass plate negatives, and there were 45,000 of these that have resulted from 40 years of digging at 23 different sites. And what I was talking about before is go back to the oldest source you can. In this case, photographs like this that might date to 1913 are so valuable because this same piece today may be gone, the heads might be missing, color might have disappeared. And so if you're going to use a base for your epigraphy in photography, this is the kind of source that you want if you're lucky enough to have access to high resolution imagery like this from so long ago. And this ties into a project that I've been working on for about 13 years now, which is to try to gather everything from the Giza necropolis and link it together in an intelligent way as a research tool online. And to date, we have these 2 different websites. The one at the top is our attempt to assemble all the traditional archaeological data, the photographs, the diaries, the maps, the plans, and link them all together intelligently. And then down below, we've moved into the 3D space and have tried to create Giza as a 3D model that I hope eventually will be a new interface for the website above, so that we'll combine both of these approaches. And if you're an amateur, you can cruise around, and if you're an expert, you can get right to what you want to, and we'll hopefully have all the bases covered. Epigraphy will feed into this, and I'll get to that a little bit later on some of the ways it might. In terms of the great draftsmen and epigraphers of the 20th century, then, one of my favorites and one of the greatest is Norman de Garris Davies. And it's a nice segue from Reisner's Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition, because he actually worked for Reisner in the early days. And this is the only photograph I've ever found of Phoebe Hearst, the original patron of Reisner's Hearst expedition, visiting the dig house at Giza and paying for a nice fantasia for the men and providing nice warm blankets for them for those cold winter nights. And there you see Phoebe Hearst and Clarence Fisher and Davies as he worked for the expedition in 1905. And here's a Western Cemetery tomb where he produced the colored illustration on the upper right. At the left is the expedition glass photo, and down below is a more recent color image. So you can see the value of each of these and how they really complement each other. And as great as Davies was, of course, his wife Nina was far greater. And she left behind a legacy that no one has matched. She's added color to the whole ensemble. And of course, at the Metropolitan Museum, you can see fabulous examples of what she's left behind. So this is a huge loss in our field that no one, to my knowledge, is producing this kind of faithful and accurate color epigraphic work. So that's not something that I can hope to cover further on as we look at some digital methods going forward. But this is a gold standard in many ways. Not matched, unfortunately, by our own Joseph Lyndon Smith, who's more from this area in New England, worked for the Harvard MFA expedition and many other places all over the world, somehow doesn't have quite the same reputation that the Davies gathered, and yet made quite a substantial contribution. And I think many of his paintings are really quite valuable. Here's one of a reburied tomb from 1913, the son of Menkaure himself, and the photo on the left, and Smith's painting on the right. So if you're interested in tracking him down, there was a spectacular show here many years ago put together by the Lescos, and you can see some of the Smith paintings today at the Fitchburg Art Museum, and I encourage you to do so. Makes a nice weekend outing. Before Carter found Tutankhamun's tomb, of course, his great strength and great skill lay not so much in his archaeological method, but in his draftsmanship. And of course, he was responsible for the spectacular drawings in the Darrell Bahri publication. And to my knowledge, he was actually working freehand, one of the few to be doing this. So not a camera lucida, not tracing like the Davies were doing, but actually freehand drawings, and that's pretty impressive. And then another very, very impressive publication, of course, is Amos Calverley and Myrtle Broom, the Abydos volumes, sumptuously produced with Rockefeller money from the Oriental Institute. And this runs the gamut, too, of beautiful photography and then enhanced photographs, sometimes painted over the photographs like this. And this is also a bit of a gold standard. And it's a shame that the entire temple has not been completed this way. So it's one thing to do direct tracing, as you see on the left there, where you have a relatively small monument, but then what do you do when you've got an entire temple, as you see on the right? Drawing one-to-one just doesn't work. And so that takes us to, I think, the pinnacle of epigraphic method that's been developed by Chicago, the Chicago House method. And on the right, you see they're working from photographic enlargements rather than attempting to trace the entire wall one-to-one. So briefly, how this system works starts with large plate camera photography, expertly set up to minimize distortion on the wall, and that produces a 16 by 20 photographic enlargement. And this is printed on a special paper with a kind of a gelatin cover so that you can actually draw on it with a pencil. So the next step is to take that photo enlargement, and here you're looking just at a little snippet of it, and to actually trace over the carved lines in pencil on the photograph. And then that photograph is brought back to the studio, and all the pencil lines are inked in right on top of the photograph with its gelatin sort of prepared surface. From there, the photograph is bleached in a chemical bath, and the photo actually disappears, leaving nothing but the ink lines from the artist's work then behind. And that's what you see going on here. So we've got the original photo, and then we've got this beautiful ink drawing. And from there, the collation process begins. So epigraphers take over at this point, really Egyptologists, who take the inked drawing, contact prints are made, look something like that, broken up into strips and brought back to the wall for collation, and they're all marked up and then given back to the artist. The corrections are argued over and put in. The mudir eventually comes in and makes the final say, and then your ink drawing is finally done. So that is the process of many, many eyes comparing this work from artist to Egyptologist, back again, copies, notes, collation sheets, and then finally the final product with its sun and shadow lines and shading indicated is ready for publication, already at this reduced scale. So not being a 6 months in Egypt kind of project and not having the budget of the epigraphic survey, a way to sort of reduce down some of that methodology, but I hope retain some of the quality then, takes us one step further, which would be a similar tracing method from photo enlargements, but in this case, using tracing paper so that you don't need to bleach out the original photo, that stays intact. And here you see the drawing has just been removed from the photograph for a little bit of clarity there. That's one method. And then the next one, obviously in our age, is to go digital and to do it on screen with a very similar type of approach with a couple of differences, which I'll get into. So in the digital realm, the first point is to differentiate the different types of artwork involved. So I've exaggerated this a little bit, but basically on the computer screen, you've got two types. You have raster or bitmap imagery, where everything is a dot, and that's what you see up above. And then you have vector imagery, where everything is a smooth, mathematically calculated line between 2 points. This is the same technology that makes text look sharp and crisp when it comes out of your laser printer. And geniuses a few decades ago realized this could be applied to the drawing process as well. So it's a modified sort of Chicago house method that I've been trying to push, what I've been calling digital epigraphy for several years now, where you start with the best photography you can, high res, hopefully historic, large plate negative photography, if you're lucky enough to have it, something like this. You do your tracing on screen with a drawing tablet, and I'll give you a quickie demo later on. So this is just a Wacom tablet and a pen, and I find it easier to use than a mouse. Some do, some don't, or a trackball. And then the photograph is removed. So similar to the bleach in the chemical bath that Chicago House uses, but in this case we're just doing it digitally. And you're left with a vector drawing that can then be applied to many, many different uses. It's even a little more versatile than your standard ink drawing. So the pen and ink drawing is using the rapidographs, of course, and when there are mistakes, you've got to pull out your blade and try to scrape some of the ink away and then redraw it. And you can only do that so many times before the paper starts to tear and rip, and when you apply the ink, it blobs all over the place. You don't have that problem here. When I first started doing this, I thought this will streamline the method and save hundreds of hours, and it'll be so much faster. And I was in for a shock because I find it doesn't really spare all that much time. The creative process here is just as intense, I think, as working with rapidographs. The advantage is that the editability is streamlined and the reusability, the repurposability is enhanced. So that means I can do all kinds of fancy things with this drawing once it's done, and I can fix my mistakes much more conveniently. So there are many ways to approach this, and one of them has to do with line quality. So in this New Kingdom relief, you can see down below, it captures the style, I think, pretty well, and shows the richly attired bearers here. But you'll notice it's a single line weight type of drawing. And there are some in the field who actually prefer this as being a more faithful or accurate rendition, and that's a perfectly legitimate approach to take. I'm going to ask you a question, though, and take a look at these feet. And if I ask you how many people are in this scene, and who's a front foot and who's a back foot and what belongs to which, I bet you'd have to think for a minute. It would be a little bit tough. So let me introduce sun and shadow lines, or different line weights. And now you see everything, I think, springs into action a little bit more clearly. You can see what leg is in front, what's behind. you've got shadows essentially being cast, so you know front from back, and maybe you can even put the number of figures together and understand it a little bit more clearly. So in the digital realm, this means a new way of thinking and a new approach over basic ink drawing with rapidographs, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I think while single line weight is certainly adequate and accurate, it's the sun and shadow lines that really give you the sense of relief, either raised or sunk, and get that point across. So what is this new way of thinking that this requires? Well, until a better method comes along, and it's almost there, but I think not quite, it means layers. So now you're thinking not just in laying down a line, but on the screen you're thinking of what's in front and what's behind. And what that basically means is you're drawing multiple copies of the same sign. So in this case, for the scribal hieroglyph, it means on top you've got your sign drawn and filled with white, so you can't see through it. And down below, you've got a copy of it filled with black, and that goes not only underneath the white one, but then it's offset a little bit in either direction, down and to the right in the case of raised relief, or up and to the left in the case of sunk relief. And over on the right, you can see at the bottom right the final result there to give you that three-dimensional look. When you get to a block or a fragment, it gets, of course, more complicated, and so you've got all of those pieces. On top, the white-filled hieroglyphs. Below, the shadow effect. Then you've also got the surface, the preserved surface area at the top of the block surface, and then the block line around the edge, and put that all together, and I don't know if it's really blown out there, but on the right, hopefully you can see what the final result is going to be. So sounds intensive. There are ways to streamline it and sort of batch process many hieroglyphs at once, and so it isn't quite as daunting as it might appear, but it does bring new challenges and new problems that basic rapidograph drawing doesn't. For example, paths. Computers like you to draw a circle or a square or any kind of shape, and they like you to have a start and an end, and they like it to meet up and close. When you have a closed path, it's easier to fill that path with a color or a texture or something. And when you don't, when you have things that go across a break from one block to another, or overlap each other multiple times, like the dotted H here, then you could be in trouble. So on the left, you see you've got these extra lines crisscrossing and confusing the reader and not accurately rendering how that hieroglyph should be done. The answer is on the right, and it's to follow the exterior, the outlines of the signs or the figures wherever possible. So this is good for avoiding that kind of confusion. It's tricky because sometimes things get stuck together that you normally wouldn't draw as one unit. For example, the man's torso and then his belt loop and his kilt, where you're trying to create a human figure as one unit and maybe a kilt as a separate unit. So some of these approaches can come back to bite you later if you've got other purposes in mind, like colorizing or mapping onto a 3D model or something like that. So that's part of the challenge, is thinking ahead and what your final purpose might be. Doing all of this, though, not only preserves and documents and enhances the usability, but I think it does enhance research possibilities as well. So this is a false door that struck me many years ago because it had some strange, compact squeezing in of hieroglyphs that looked secondary, and a giant figure of the woman and humongous hieroglyphs in the top panel up above, and some other weird things that looked asymmetrical and out of place. And it made me wonder if this might be a case of prefabrication, a stela that was prepared almost genderless and assigned to somebody later. And so playing with that on the digital side of things allows me to experiment with adding the prefab elements if this was intended for a male, where you can get some of the male pronouns placed in there and highlighted, or perhaps removing everything that has to do with a specific gender altogether, and maybe this is the prefab nature of how this thing was originally carved and waiting for an owner to come in later, or to even compare the symmetrical sides on each side, the two jambs here, where they're identical texts, but now I've removed everything that is identically carved and just left in everything that is done differently. And so very clearly you can see how the changes are brought from one side to the other, and whether we're dealing with multiple artists and multiple hands, or just someone who is dyslexic or forgetting to add some of the details from one side to another. But these elements come to the fore, and they are repurposable, and with digital epigraphy, I think, easier to manipulate. And of course, at any time, you can pull the signs out and create your paleography charts and line things up beautifully and resize them if you need to, or otherwise enhance them for publication. So along the way, paying attention to the actual monuments, and in this case I've flipped this one so the actual lighting matches the way that we tend to use the convention in our drawing methods. We always assume the light is coming from the upper left and coming down to the lower right. And we've got a good example of raised relief and sunk relief here. So once again, you can see where the sun lines and where the shadow lines would belong. Up above there at the tops or on the left side of the quail chick here, there's casting your shadow. When we get down to the sunk relief, it's going to be on the back side of the wig here. And that's the way you would draw such a false door as well. Where it gets tricky sometimes is where to put the line down. So in a case like this with sunk relief, you can see there's an outside edge and then there's a deep cut down inside. And the answer is to try to follow the outside of the cut because that's what the original artist was carving. But it is true that sometimes you get a tremendous bevel and distance between here and here. And if that's going to produce a distorted kind of a look, sometimes you may need to split the difference and draw your line somewhere in between so that the interior decoration doesn't appear miles away from the exterior line. So that translation of almost 3D into 2D is something to be aware of. And then it's not just carved lines, of course, it's also modeling. And there are various conventions for using connected series of dots, either larger dots closer together and then smaller dots further apart. I don't know if this slide is too blown out with the projector, but maybe you can see some of the musculature here represented in series of dots in the legs and the arms. And in this Nubian bark stand of Atlanersa, he's actually quite the muscular fellow. And so there's an awful lot of modeling that needs to happen. And that's possible to do digitally as well. Other conventions have to do with plaster. And this is an interesting chronological one because you can see here, very often the Egyptians will fill a break or a mistake or a hole with plaster, that's the pink area here, and then carve right into it. So you can see the hieroglyphs actually added into the plaster. And then of course when they fall out, by the time we come along, we just think, oh, well that's damage, or oh, that was never carved, or we don't know what's happening. So you've got to imagine those features as well. And so reproducing the difference between carving in limestone and carving in plaster becomes archaeologically significant. And there are conventions here to indicate the plaster, such as this outlined area with the little circles and other types of stippling, and the reed leaf is still visible even within the plaster repair. And then some colleagues disagree with me, but I'd suggest that digital epigraphy can even be used for painting. So you can follow the outlines of very unusual or asymmetrical brushstrokes like this and still create them with vector lines and get a usable result. So it's not something I work with too much, since these days most of my work is at Giza with carved limestone and raised relief and sunk relief, but I certainly think it's quite doable. So all of this can feed in to future attempts to try to make the sites more accessible. And here is our Giza project at Harvard, our 3D model of the Giza necropolis. And the next steps, once you've got digital epigraphy in this kind of serviceable condition, is to stick it on the walls here and then use these as clickable interfaces, reproductions of Giza in the 4th dynasty or the 5th or the 6th or 1925 or 2013 or whatever you want to do. There is a role for epigraphy going forward, provided that you're thinking about how you produce it and what you want to use it for and whether it's headed for something like this kind of 3D model or not. And I'll give you an example here. If you go out to Giza and look at this particular tomb in the Western Cemetery, you will see nothing but this hole in the ground filled in with fallen debris. But when Lepsius was there in the 1840s, he liked it a lot, and he brought it home to Berlin. And this is the rendering up above and a plaster cast painted in East Berlin in the 1970s and 80s of the beautiful painted chapel that was originally there. Now all this color is gone, but the chapel itself was recently restored and put on view in the Neues Museum in Berlin, and that's what you see up above. And the photography of it I commissioned a few years ago, and what you see below is the 3D computer model from our Giza project, where it's actually been texture mapped back onto the chapel walls. And ooh, that's very much blown out. I apologize for that, but believe it or not, that's the facade of Mir Ib's tomb, as you can see it put back in our computer model, and is visible in reality, of course, in Berlin, but not in Giza. Similarly, from just little fragments of Khafre inscriptions here, which you've probably seen in plaster casts in the Metropolitan Museum, we can complete the inscription and try to restore Khafre's pyramid temple as well, and to make intelligent, hopefully, estimations of original statue heights. We're still arguing about that, colossal or not colossal, based on the fragments that were found by various expeditions, but hopefully we'll get it right in the end. And then the ultimate is the restoration back to the 4th dynasty. So here's 1927, the discovery of Meresank, and up above on the left is the expedition shot, on the right is a color shot in reality, and now I'll take you into the computer model as an example of how digital epigraphy could be enhanced and recreate the entire chapel. So in a case like this, we know what the colors should be, and so we can faithfully reproduce them. That's not always the case. With Mir Ib, we'd probably have a pretty good chance of restoring his chapel pretty close to what you see here for Meresank. But here's a case where digital epigraphy can provide the base foundation of this type of reconstruction. So we're always asking ourselves on the Giza project, where are we headed? What's the goal here? Are we trying to show Giza on the day someone was interred? Are we trying to show Giza the day Reisner found a tomb? Are we trying to show it today? All of these are legitimate representations. They're all constructs, and hopefully we are not misleading the public with some of the educated guesses we need to do. I think we have more work to do in terms of flagging or somehow delimiting what is known and attested and what is theoretical and surmised and thus restored. That's a rather low-res quick tour, but here's a slightly higher-res image of the Meresank walls. And in this case, this drawing has been based upon the original publication drawings, which I think were done by the original Reisner expedition and not up to snuff. So to start from scratch and to do much more modern and I hope faithful epigraphy would probably produce a very different result. But this is an approach we're using at Harvard in our teaching, where the students come into this visualization center, they wear 3D glasses, and it allows them in real time to explore different monuments of the site, to go down burial shafts, and hopefully we'll be able to add more epigraphic examples to more tombs in the future, and maybe even colorize them as well. 3D scanning has a part in this too. That's a plaster cast, by the way. Don't panic, the way it's precariously balanced on a book to get it up to the 3D scanner. But that has a role as well, and trying to capture inscriptions with this type of scanning will make them easier prey, I think, for faithful epigraphic reproduction. And if you're going to scan things in 3D, you might as well start printing them in 3D as well. So once you've got your wireframes and your computer models, it's just a short step to recreating some of these things at small scales or larger scales. Other tools that can help us out, RTI, or reflectance transformation imaging, and I know some of you are working with that here to great success. This is basically just photographing the same piece from multiple angles, so you're getting all of the lighting effects that you would normally want if you're studying this or collating a drawing. Trying to see that facial detail while you might reflect the sun with your mirror from the left or from the right, and different details would jump out at you. So that's a great tool that I hope will come in ever more handy in this kind of drawing. Importing a photograph like this, we're not quite there, this interactive way to do it in a drawing program like Adobe Illustrator, but each one of these is a separate photograph, and you could certainly bring each photograph in on its own layer and constantly jump back and forth from one layer to another to see if you're drawing the right lines or seeing the detail of that eye or other hieroglyphs involved. So RTI is a pretty useful tool. Through all of this, the key, of course, is getting back to the original and the collation process, whether it's paper, whether it's ink, whether it's a collation sheet or a digital product. And I think that is not to be forgotten. Obviously, it's more time and labor intensive when the original piece is far away rather than in a museum collection and better accessible. Will the process become more streamlined so that, who knows, there are digital collation sheets going forward and you can make your notes right on screen? That's probably one option that's coming. And finally, when you're done, where to record, right? Traditionally, it's journal articles, it's publications, it's low-budget monographs, which maybe can't afford the color illustrations, so you're thinking black and white line drawings. And that will cover a multitude of sins. You don't have to worry about things like closed paths and what are the future uses. This is just a line drawing with black ink lines on white, and so you can stop there and you're all fine. But other options, of course, mean web printing, for example, and publishing in the widest sense of the word. Digital publishing now is growing, and printing and paper printed in our field are becoming ever more expensive and lower print runs. So the key online, of course, is can you get close? Can you get up and see the details? Is the resolution going to hold, not only for photographs, of course, but for line work as well? So that's one key. And then our portable devices, I think, will start playing a larger role as well. So whether it's iBooks or eBooks or any type of portable device here, the key again is can you get up into the details that you need to see, and will the resolution hold? And by doing the digital epigraphy with vector lines, you're fine. You're not going to end up with the raster problems and the bitmap issues and things collapsing as they enlarge. So that's an excellent recent drawing of the Narmer palette. And as I mentioned before, I think our conventions are pretty streamlined now. I think we've got a nice balance of what we're trying to represent and interpret and what we're trying to stay away from. For example, a crack that doesn't interrupt any carved line will normally be left out, unless it's a block line, for example, and that adds to the clarity. But conventions are changing, styles are changing, and I don't know if going forward this is the type of convention that we'll start to see more of or less of, but I'm sure that the next generation will look back on this one and probably say, well, you did this, but you didn't do that. In the meantime, this is what we've got for digital epigraphy, which I hope in its more successful versions won't really announce its digitalness particularly or show to be such great competition with an ink drawing. Hopefully both of them will fulfill the same purpose and be just as clear and just as readable. And the challenges don't go away, just as this recent discovery at Abosir came up, and you can see all of the different challenges waiting for you, whether it's sunk relief or not, or painted or not, or finished, or carved and painted, or painted but not carved. So representing all of the different variations in a very recent discovery like this is one of the challenges that makes this lots of fun. So that's sort of a quick overview of some of the issues that we're dealing with in our class and struggling with. And I thought in the few minutes I have left, I will try to switch over now and give you just a quick look at some of the building blocks in putting a drawing like this together. So let me get rid of that, and while the cats entertain you, I'll switch over to a different monitors arrangement so I can see what I'm doing. Let's see if that will work. So I'm in Adobe Illustrator now, and basically this is just a drawing surface, and I'll take my tablet and my pen, and you can see that I'm now a mouse. So what I've done is I've imported a photograph in here, and I'll take this color one. Whether you're using color or black and white is also an issue, depends on what you can get. And then of course your drawing lines, you want to know, am I going to be able to see my lines up against that? So all the elements here are in place. You've got the edge of the block, the outside of the block. Then you have got, where's a good example to show this? Well, maybe down here. So you've got the edge of the decorated surface. That's an issue to think about. And then on top of that, of course, you've got the carved hieroglyphs. And the way to do it is to do the outside of your decoration and then worry about the interior detail secondly. So in terms of vector drawing, the way they're different from others is I will take my drawing tool pen right here, and I can either just tap on the tablet like this and join up the path, and now I have a finished, complete, and black-filled element here. Or I can take my pen tool and hold it down on the tablet and stretch. And now you see that's how I create my curves. So those handle points aren't going to print, but the line will. And you see what happens when I crisscross myself. That's what I was talking about before. All kinds of strange things happen. So basic building blocks. I can tap to create a straight line between one point and another. Or I can pull and drag. So that's one important point. The other is down here, where I've got the ability to do two things to everything I draw. I can fill it with a color, I can fill the shape, and I can also determine how thick my line is. So right now this is set to have a line with no thickness and to be completely filled with black. So I'm going to change that. I'm now going to make my line thickness black and my fill pattern to nothing. So now when I take my pen tool, You can see this is a little closer to what I'm looking for with digital epigraphy. So now I can control the curves, and there is no fill pattern getting in my way. I can also control just how thick that line is. Right now it's a 1-point line. I can make it much fatter, which you probably never need to do. For most of our drawing purposes, it's a 0.25 line right there. And the beauty of this is I can then adjust certain elements. So I can grab that little point and say, you know, I got that wrong. He really needs to be more like that. Or I need to extend a nose that way, or move this out here. So that's the basic principle. So once we get to something like a T, I can take my line, and in fact, the beauty of a high-res image is trying to get up nice and big, and then can start and just follow the outline of the carving. And I'll do this nice and fast so it won't be perfect, and the beauty is I can fix it later. That's what's tougher with pen and ink drawing. And I'll come around. And where you put the points down is not so much a problem in this type of drawing, because the number of points isn't going to be so huge that it will destroy your drawing. There are other types of fancy artwork that have thousands and thousands of points and thousands of layers, and that's tougher. So there is my drawing all set. I can then highlight it and do my relief issue. So it's filled with nothing right now. I'm going to fill it with white, and then I might do a copy and a paste in place, and I'll just move that down a little. You can do that as an exact distance once you get lots of hieroglyphs. And I'll fill that second guy with black, and then I'll bring the other one in front of it. The range, bring to front. So there we go. So let me get this out of the way, all the way out of the way. And there you see you've got a raised relief T. You can emphasize that more, make it thicker or not, depending if you're dealing with a huge standing figure or a tiny little detailed image. But that's the basic building block of digital epigraphy. So let me zoom out a little bit, and I'll go down to the prefab version. I feel like Julia Child, you know, you mix the cake and then you put it in the oven and you say, I've got one done 40 minutes later, and you pull it out. So that's this one right here. Get rid of that. So here I've got all my different layers, and I've just made this one visible. But now I can create another one for my block lines, another one for my surface edges, another one for my drawing, and then even some modeling on a separate layer if I want to. So those are all the building blocks, and how it's so much easier when everything is on its own layer. Then you can be turning them on and off. You can say, well, I can't see the photo underneath. I've got to get this guy out of the way, and there it is. Or I just want to see the drawing and see what happened with a non-closed path. You see it starts here and it ends here, so it's filled with white and looks very strange when I have a photograph below it. That's where things get dicey. So here's a fancier finished drawing where you see the challenge when you've got all these different blocks, and that's a shape, or that's a shape, or that's a shape. Or here, what I call the Hitler dancers over here. And how to draw them. This is where it gets difficult, because you see this person is on this block and the rest of the person is on this block. So you can't draw a single human as one path. You've got to break it up and deal with all of this crack going on down here, and that's part of the challenge. So once you're filling with white and filling with black, weird things happen, and you've got to make intelligent decisions about where to start and where to stop. And you see the kilt now is part of the drawing, connected to the leg and all of that. It's fine if I'm publishing this as a black and white line drawing, but I'm in deep trouble if I'm trying to then texture map that or colorize it and make the kilt white and the skin color yellow or something. Then I'm in trouble, and I've got to play around a bit. So this is what I meant by thinking ahead and thinking what your possible uses might be. The Chicago House method would do a kind of more careful rendering of this damaged area. In this case, I'm just filling it, whoops, with a gray screen there, and you can see it's 10% gray. It actually looks quite white on the screen up there, but on my screen it looks nice and gray to do the damage. So you can either take the easy way out like this, or you can actually try to faithfully reproduce every crack and seam in the original shading and try to do it that way. So when blocks are self-contained like this, it's a little bit easier. When you've got a scene that's got lots of blocks going on, you see all the layers that come in handy. The decoration on the top, the surface block line filled with white, the actual block outline filled with the the gray right there. And eventually you can start thinking in terms of layers and things get clearer. So that's a whirlwind tour of digital epigraphy, Adobe Illustrator. It's actually quite fun once you get comfortable with it. And if you get one of these little guys, you never go back, really. I can't do this kind of drawing with a trackball or a trackpad or something like that. And these models are about $160. They're pretty simple. If you want to spend the big bucks, you can get the kind that is actually a screen where you can actually see what you're tracing and you can draw right on it. I find that's I'm a little less comfortable with that because I haven't used it much, but makes a great Christmas present. So I'm happy to answer a question, and if I haven't stumped you completely, I want to thank you very much for your attention and hope that we'll get some new candidates in working in epigraphy this way. Thanks very much. Can I answer anything? Yes, please.
With the relief line drawings, have you tried using like a 3D reconstruction of the surface and then using like level sets to determine the line position?
Do you mean extruding the drawing from the photo, or how do you mean?
Yeah, so like you could say extruding the drawing from the photo, creating like a sort of 3D representation, and then taking a slice of that,
Yep.
and then creating lines based on whether your slice was under or over the surface.
But you would still need to create that first foundation and do the hard work to make that possible first, right?
Yeah, but I mean, you could automate the process of making the three-dimensional model, and then you would just have to tweak the slices until you got.
Do you mean with some kind of auto trace program around a photo lines or things? Because that's where I've never had much luck. A lot of Photoshop experts say, oh, well, just take the image there and run auto trace, and it'll zip around that line and all of that. But I can't get an Egyptologically useful result that way.
Yeah, that was basically my question. I assumed you'd try something in order.
Yep.
A hitch.
I'd love to. I mean, that would streamline the process. One thing I didn't show, which I should probably add when I hinted that there may be a savior for this layer issue, is that in Illustrator and not in any other program, there is now this new tool. Let me fill this with black. Right here, it's this guy that to me looks like a seahorse, but you can actually grab that tool, and what was always impossible, you can actually thicken the line right there and make it thicker or thinner. So theoretically, when I first saw this, I thought, oh, I'm saved. I don't have to do layers anymore. I can make sun and shadow lines within a single line. The more you play with it, you realize that it's a little tricky, and to control it, you can actually double click and up comes a window where you can say, be this thick, be this thin. And so if you want to master all of that, yeah, you could probably do it. I think where this would come in handy is in an area like this, where suddenly this needs to get thick down under his chin, and I don't have the luxury of closing the path and making it easy. So there's a case where I might not do 2 layers here. I might just draw this one single line with no fill, and then use that thickness tool and thicken up his chin that way. So that's a kind of a neat development, and I think it needs some more experimentation. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I could ask about the expense and cost per picture, per image.
Mm-hmm.
Working at Chicago House, we all knew that they worked there 90 years, mostly on Medina Albu only.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
They produced about 30 plates a year, and they had to have a whole staff of 19 people employed
Right.
a year.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very expensive proposition.
Sure.
Is this going to be as expensive or less? I mention this because Ricardo Camillos, of course, went off and imitated the Mies Caverly's method, reinforced photographs.
Right.
And he did many volumes in Nubia in the emergency when they had to get it done.
Mm.
He got an awful lot of work done.
Sure.
Single individual,
Yep.
as did Mies. So there are cost differences in the past. What is this going to cost?
Great question. Part of that cost lies in all of those pairs of eyes that are doing the collating and the checking and the redrawing. So in a way, you could drag this out, dare I say, just as long, even though it's digital, if you've got enough checkers saying that, well, look, I've done the best I can, but I'm not seeing past the problems. You need to take a look and collate it for me. That is, in many ways, an ideal solution. The more consultants you have on this, the best. But of course, it drags out the process and slows it all down. So this is certainly cheaper. You're not dealing with chemicals and producing the photos and drawing on them. All you need is the high-res scan, which may or may not cost you money, depending on who owns it and is willing to give it to you. Or you take your own photography. So if you're doing that, you need to be in Egypt one season ahead of your drawings, right? Go there, take the photos, bring them home, prepare all these drawings in the studio, and then next season bring your collation sheets, your laser printouts, back to the site and do your collating there. So there's some cost involved that way. But otherwise, I think you could compare them a little bit. Certainly materials, once you've owned the software and you've got the laptop or the big screen to do it, that's a fixed cost. But then it's a streamlined and pretty cheap operation, unless you're going to say, now I need 3 people to collate this and correct me and work with me. Do they need a salary? How many months do they need to finish with their work? And then before you know it, you've dragged things out to Chicago House proportions. I think the epigraphic survey is a pinnacle to strive for and a spectacular operation and a tried and tested regime. I also know they're experimenting with digital approaches now, and who knows if one day they will switch over completely or not. We will see. Yes?
Yeah, just a quick question, Peter. So you're co-teaching this course with Alex, of course, but what do you think of his use of the big Wacom tablet? And I think he's using Photoshop, not
Yep.
Illustrator. Have you played around with that technique as well?
I have trouble with vector lines in Photoshop. They confuse me no end, but Alex works this way. He works with raster drawings, and in fact, I was in Marseille last week when he was doing the class on working with Photoshop that way. And so I might ask people in our class, is Jen with us? Yeah, Jen, you were there last week, right? So are you now coming down on the Photoshop side or the Illustrator side? Not to put you on the spot. No pressure.
Since I work with Egyptian material, I can't really see a way to use Photoshop on Egyptian stuff and still get the shadowing in, because what we did was trace directly over the Maya image
Yep.
and use different line weights to distinguish between things, but there was no the raised relief or sunk relief, things like that, were not taken into account by by shadows, just
Right.
by line weights. It was very different. Actually, just uploaded my drawing in different class things. So you can take a look at it and tell me.
Excellent. So she's getting an A. That was the right answer. No, it's certainly another method to work with, and Alex is among the best in reproducing these Mayan hieroglyphs, which are so difficult for me to comprehend and a whole different challenge. We work in a much finer line quality, and we're worried about these relief issues and things. And of course, the Mayan hieroglyphs are jutting out into your face, so it presents different challenges. I'm not saying you can't do it, and in fact, there are vector tools, pen tools in Photoshop, but I find that Illustrator follows this method and aligns with our mandate a little bit more conveniently. That would be my stock answer. It's a great question. Yeah, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. I would like to ask you maybe about a next step. So when you're talking about particularly in alphabetic languages where like Greek and Latin, where we can have limbs that match to more or less what we're seeing, the two phases of transcription, right? The one where you're trying to do the dramatic transcription where you're trying to mimic what you see, and the one where you're editing.
Mm-hmm.
Looks to me like you're in the first phase here. And if you were to start trying to model the content of what's in your inscription, which is much, much more complicated because it's not in what you have, would you consider, and you got me thinking about this when you started talking about the layers, would you, I mean, you can't make a layer for each thing, that would be insane. But what if, with something like SVG, which would lose information, you wouldn't have as much detail as you have with your vector lines in Illustrator. But if you were able
But why not? Because SVG is essentially a vector format.
I'm wondering about when you start doing stippling and things
Yeah.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't tried, a lot of SVG I've seen is fairly simple.
Right.
But if you were to export an SVG, you might be able to start actually identifying components
Mm-hmm.
and not have to make a layer for every single doohickey.
Sure.
And then you could start actually comparing or, really trying to manipulate these things algorithmically as well.
Mhm.
I just wonder, is that something that you're thinking about? Or?
My thinking for next step is how to get these things back on the 3D models of the tomb walls. And how adequate or inadequate my decision making was in closing paths and keeping things discrete. And maybe the answer is more and more layers to solve that problem. It's a challenge. So I have to decide up front, where is this going? Is it just a line drawing in a journal article? And then I have a certain set of challenges. Is it going to be a 3D colorized reconstruction on a tomb wall with a depth to it that needs to cast shadows, as we saw in the tomb at Marisank? Those are all valid questions.
Or
But-
data mining.
Yeah. To attach intelligent, searchable qualities to these things would be fantastic. Up to this point, I've just plucked hieroglyphs out and created paleography charts, and I've done it all manually, which was much more streamlined than pen and ink. But they're not smart hieroglyphs in that sense. They don't know who they are and what shapes they are. And if there was a Unicode epigraphy, hey, I'm all for it. So I'm told we've run out of time. I want to thank you very much once again for joining tonight. Appreciate it.